So let's start, shall we? Dear intellectual property lovers all over the world, most welcome to this holiday seminar arranged by the Institute of Intellectual Property Law and Market Law at the Stockholm University. As you can see, my name is Jonas Nordell, and I am chair of the board of the Institute. And today we are happy to present and discuss three brand new dissertations. It's from David Johansson from Sweden, Giulia Priora from Hungary, but you are now in Italy, and Tito Rendas from Portugal. Three brand new dissertations, three topics, and by that I leave the screen to our director, Eleonora Rosati, please.
Thank you very much, Jonas, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our traditional holiday seminar. Indeed, as Jonas has explained, today we will be discussing brand new insights into different areas of intellectual property. We are really delighted and honored that our new doctors of law have accepted our invite. As I was pointing out during the preparation to this webinar, it is also quite timely that we are having this event this week after, as you might have seen, there has been a huge discussion elicited by a controversial Wall Street Journal editorial questioning the appropriateness of Dr. Jill Biden using the doctor title, since she's not an MD, but just, and here I'm using air quotation marks, a doctor of education. Of course, we are very proud of our doctors, irrespective of whether they are doctors of medicine or other doctors. And indeed, it is with great honor and pride that Tito Rendas, Giulia Priora, and David Johansson can call themselves Dr. Rendas, Dr. Priora, and Dr. Johansson. As you might have seen from the program, we will be also having commentaries accompanying each presentation, and I'm very grateful that Professor Jan Rosén, who is the current chair of the Swedish Copyright Association, the Swedish group of ALAI, has accepted the invite, and so has Dr. Frantzeska Papadopoulou, who is the head of the IP group at Stockholm University and a board member of IFIM. So before we start, a further note of thanks. I would like to thank our LLM students, Alex Zanatta Miura and Riana Harvey, who are also the co-chief editors of the Stockholm Intellectual Property Law Review, who have accepted the invite and have actually volunteered to help with the organization of this event. So huge thanks to them for the excellent contribution to today's seminar. Final word of thanks to our IFI amanuensis Alva Wester, a student at Stockholm University, who has contributed substantially to the organization and administration involved in today's seminar. Okay, without further ado, just a brief overview of the topics we will be discussing. We will be focusing on damages in intellectual property cases. As you know, for those of you practicing IP, this is of course a very thorny issue. There has been some minimum harmonization at the EU level, but significant divergences remain across EU member states. Then we will be focusing on copyright exceptions and limitations, an evergreen topic in the copyright discussion, but perhaps even more timely now after an influx of case law, which has prompted a reconsideration of the place of exceptions and limitations. And after that, we will be discussing the role of fairness in EU copyright law and policy, and indeed the theories of distributive justice and how they affect the harmonization rationale as seen also in very recent legislative initiatives. You are very welcome to use the chat function to ask your questions and make your comments. So please do use this possibility, and we will pick up the comments and questions at the end of each presentation and then in the final discussion. So I would like to give the floor to David. We look forward to hearing your insights on the important topic of IP damages. David, over to you, and then Frantzeska for her commentary.
Yeah, thanks you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here. Yeah. So let's see, I'm gonna share my presentation. Is it up?
Yes, we can see it.
Let's see. Okay, so my name is David Johansson. I'm from Uppsala University, and I finished my PhD in late September this year. And well, damage and compensation in an intellectual property context. What is that? Why did I choose this title? It's actually, my dissertation is in Swedish. But this damage and damages, or damage and compensation, would be the direct English translation. And I would say that what I'm trying to do in this dissertation is that I'm looking at the relationship between, on one hand, the thought or the notion of damage as the actual damage that has occurred, economic damage, on one hand. Then on the other hand, we have the compensation. And those two are not always the same thing. And I think that that's the ongoing theme, the overall theme of my thesis. That's everything I says over 400 pages, repeating it over and over again. So what is the relationship then between damage, the actual damage, and compensation on one hand? Well, I think if you have studied tort law, I think it might be, I wouldn't say it's safe to say, but this could be an illustration. Can you actually see my cursor as well? My mouse cursor, where I'm, yeah. This could be an illustration of it, but you tend to think about, you have this outer shell, like this egg, so to speak. This outer shell could represent, let's say, the actual damage. And then at the core of that, we only have the small core, which is the legal compensation. And this would, of course, illustrate that the actual damage is always quite large, but the legal compensation and the actual economic compensation that you are entitled to is always smaller. I've seen this illustration in some textbooks in some countries, and I'd say that when you, as a law student in Sweden, when we teach tort law, this could be kind of the image that we're giving to our students, at least. That this is the relationship between actual damage and legal damages, legal compensation. And then again, of course, speaking of different graphs, you could also talk about the relationship this way, that these are simply two different things. Compensation is one thing, then the actual damage for an infringement, for instance, or for anything, is another thing. And these two, of course, will overlap, but they will never overlap completely. So on one hand, you will have the actual damage here, and then again, you have the compensation, and the compensation won't cover the complete actual damage. That's never possible. But on the other hand, compensation covers other areas as well that goes beyond the actual economic damage, because compensation, of course, is its own legal thing with its own legal definition to some extent. And I'm not sure how controversial this would be compared to this image. But from a Swedish perspective, when I studied Swedish tort law and tried to look at court cases and also studying the cases from the European Union, because there aren't that many on intellectual property damages, but there are a few, you can clearly see that there is this constant struggle between how do we position the compensation in relation to the actual damage. And it's almost like we don't really like to state this. In our perfect world, we would like the compensation and the actual damage to be the same. And if these two diverge to some extent, we tend to cover it up with different principles. But I mean, this is how I would perceive the relationship between compensation and actual damage. They're not always the same thing, which would be obvious for some people. But when you study doctrine and court cases, well, I'm not sure if this is the general view. Okay, then again, this illustration could also be slightly altered, because if you think about actual damage as a concept, well, we don't have this clear delineation of what actual damage is, right? Especially not in the intellectual property field, where the damage is non-physical. So on an area where we have no borders, like physical borders with clear marks of where the damage starts and ends, of course, it's really hard to talk about a clear-cut actual damage. It becomes more of this sphere or this cloud where you don't really know where it starts and ends, because how do you determine the start and end of all negative economic consequences? So with that in mind, if you look at the Article 13 of the Enforcement Directive, as Eleonora said, well, we have this minimum harmonization in Europe, but as you can see, well, you're supposed to take into account all relevant, all appropriate aspects, such as negative economic consequences. That's a really broad definition, which is, I suppose, necessary. But as you can see, what are all appropriate aspects? Well, it depends. It can be different from case to case. Of course, it can differ also between country and country, what you tend to look at. But I'd say that from a Swedish perspective, this is kind of how the directive has been implemented. So we look at all the negative economic consequences. But as you can see here, negative economic consequences is only an example. We can also look at lost profits, but unfair profits, and other than economic factors in some cases. So you can see here already, when looking at Article 13, you can see that the strict definition of damage that you will have in some countries, at least in Sweden, we start to go beyond that already here, maybe. And also, as you can see, you're also allowed to have lump sums in some cases, in the appropriate cases, that is. That makes you think that, okay, when would that be? I guess that lump sums could be something to look at in all cases where it's not possible to calculate damages in strict meaning, which would be, I guess, almost all cases. You would turn to some kind of lump sum approach. So I would say already when looking at Article 13 here, if you look at the relationship between 1A and 1B, well, you could say that these are maybe not two alternative methods. After all, these are two methods that you will always be somewhere in between. Yeah. Now, I'm not sure, how is my time looking, actually? Just tell me if I'm going over. And of course, we have to mention Article 3, the directive, especially 3.2, about the reminder, you could call it, that the remedy should be effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. And also, it shouldn't be abused, of course. So how do these things relate to each other? Of course, we know that effectiveness on one hand and proportion on the other hand, dissuasion, it's all about trying to find a balance, I guess. But Article 3.2, to my knowledge, it would have been nice to see the EU court actually discuss these things when it comes to intellectual property damages and actually try to apply these principles. But on the other hand, they're very general, you say, and I think a lot of us recognize these three things from other areas. Although misuse, as you might have seen before, it has been addressed. And I think this is, if there's one EU court ruling on intellectual property everyone should read, it's the OTK case. I'm not sure, I can't pronounce it in Polish, so I just call it OTK. The OTK ruling where the Polish court, in Polish law, they used triple up compensation, and then they alter it to double up compensation. They used the reasonable compensation as a foundation of calculating the damages, and then they multiplied it by 2, basically. So, and in this case, for some reason, it was quite funny, if you ask me, that this would go all the way up and this be discussed, because of course, as the court says, the EU court states, it's that these kind of double up compensations are allowed. As you could see from Article 13, it states it explicitly that lump sums are allowed. But yet again, the question was, when it comes to the relationship between compensation and then actual damage, well, the notion of actual damage is, of course, that you should have causation, right? Because if there's no causation, in our area, it wouldn't even be considered damage per se. It would just be an economic event on the market as anything else. But so the question was, if you allow lump sums, well, could you do it, or do you need causation as well? Well, of course, if you allow lump sums, there could be no full causation. And that's it, I suppose, what the EU court is stating. And that's really important, because if you think about it, what would happen if the court had gone the other way and said that, well, lump sums are okay as long as you can prove causation? Well, that would be the same thing as saying that lump sums are not allowed. And also providing strict requirements of evidence regarding causation in this area of law. Well, in this IP context, that would kind of make the whole system meaningless. So this case was actually really important, because if you had gone within the lines of the Advocate General, there might have been a different outcome here, which would have seriously halted, seriously have limited the scope of the directive. And also, of course, I guess if you read IP catalog, for instance, or other sources, this thing of punitive damages has always been really interesting to discuss for people. But what the court does in this case is that it says that doubling up the reasonable royalty, of course, is it punitive damages or is it not? Well, to put it frankly, or in my opinion, the court kind of says, well, this is not the view we're taking. We're not even going to discuss punitive damages. We're going to discuss it from abuse perspective instead, according to Article 3. And of course, in some areas, if you double up or triple up, and probably if you know that you go beyond the scope of the actual damage, in those rare cases, I would argue this, then it could be abuse. But as long as you don't really know if you go beyond the actual damage, yet again, it's hard to talk about abuse. So it's kind of the higher, it's also kind of sets a higher, as opposed to the minimum standard of the directive. Like the upper limits might not be that low, might be quite hard. And then again, to go back to one illustration, to this illustration again, it also shows that you might have proven damage, of course, to some extent. Then you have the actual damage, which is kind of unknown, except for the part where we have the proven damage. And then you have the compensation, for instance, when it comes to double up. Here it shows, this is my way of trying to illustrate that compensation will, in most cases, go beyond the proven damage in a strict sense. And then again, we have the actual damage floating in the background, still quite unknown. But it doesn't matter, because according to Article 13, we could consider other factors as well. We could use lump sums, etc. I'm not sure, am I running out of time now? That's my question. For a timing perspective, Eleonora.
A few minutes left, thank you.
Okay. So this is my way, actually, I'm not sure how weird this slide is, because if you think about it, we tend to talk about the actual damage and proven damage as the same thing, right? But I think when you look at Article 13 and you study intellectual property damages, well, you should stay open to the fact that proven damage is one thing, in a strict sense. And the actual damage is another thing. So the question would be, can you go beyond the proven damage? Well, yes, of course. If you allow lump sums, that's exactly what you do. Then again, can you go beyond the actual damage? Well, you shouldn't do it, but then again, if you do it knowingly, or it's likely that you go beyond the actual damage, well, don't do it, of course. That would be the overall message, I suppose. But when reading, really, at least when I'm reading the OTK case. But then again, what is the actual damage? Can anyone say, is this more than the compensation here? This blue sphere here? Because the thing is, I'm not sure how many people here who have worked with these cases. I wonder how many have seen the case where they know that this is the full extent of the actual damage. This is it. It's this sum, or approximately this sum, at least. It's not more, it's not less. Of course, this is quite a rare case. Often we have this unclear image of the full extent of the actual damage. And this leaves us on this left side instead when we try to discuss compensation. Then again, the Swedish Trademark Act, I'm not sure how interesting it is. It's also the old translation. They changed it last year in some minor details. You can see, as an example, if you have a national implementation now in Sweden, it also says chapter 9, it should be chapter 8. That's my bad, sorry. Chapter 8. But as you can see here, that when the amount of the compensation is decided, particular considerations should be given to lost profit, profit that has been made by the party that committed the infringement, damage cost to the reputation of the trade symbol, moral damage, and the interest of the right holder that infringements are not committed, like prevention more than compensation when it comes to bullet 5. And I suppose that just by looking at these provisions and comparing it to Article 13, quite similar, I'd say, you can see that it's not always only about strict definition of damage. But the funny thing is that from a Swedish perspective, at least, the discussion has been that, okay, very well, we have these points, but maybe we can only actually take these points into consideration to the extent they correlate to the actual damage. So it's like full circle going back. It's like you start with the problem that, damage is really hard to prove. We need some new legal definition and point out what you can actually argue around. Let's solve it by stating these 5 different things. And then again, when we come back as intellectual property lawyers, like, wait a minute, we should adhere to general tort law principles. So we need causation, and we can only look at these points to the extent they actually correlate to the definition, our notion of economic damage. And then it's like you rule out all these different points and go back to lost profit again, if you have this narrow view. And that's kind of how it has been in Swedish courts, at least, and maybe to some extent even in doctrine. But I say that this is a legal text, just like you saw Article 13. And if it says that you can look at these factors, you should do it, of course, even though it doesn't fully correspond to the notion of actual economic damage. So I suppose that I'm going to finish with this one. I have more slides, but it's going to be far enough. This is kind of a version of a slide I've been going back and forward to, and I have a version of this in the beginning of my thesis as well. I tend to think of it as a scale where you look at different problems and you have different tendencies. And one thing I call this the traditional approach, or even dogmatic approach, as opposed to the contextual approach. And I suppose that when you look at damages, if it's within an IP field or anywhere else, you will tend to evaluate different aspects more heavily than others. You will tend to favor some aspects more heavily than others. And I suppose that in Sweden, at least, causation, calculations, looking at the actual value, for instance, empty phrases, basically like avoiding overcompensation, avoiding undercompensation. have been quite leading to some extent, at least in a formal sense, for courts. When you can't prove the actual damage, you just compensate it with general evidence relief. On the other hand, you have this, what I would call contextual approach, where you look at other aspects such as prevention as opposed to only compensation. You look at account of profits, which is in other countries in Europe, this is kind of norm. In Sweden, it isn't. It has never been. Account of profits has always been something suspicious, considered like the opposite, and what do you call it? Like the opposite of actual damage, of course, almost. And go to more overall assessments, stuff like that. And I'm not supposed where we are, or even where I would put myself, but I'd say that we need to look at both these aspects. Not only stay on the left side of the spectrum when determining damages, because if you look at the Article 13 and the Swedish legal text, well, it covers this whole spectrum. And it also means going beyond the strict notion of economic damage and looking at the overall picture of what compensation is and could be. I suppose that's my time. I'm not going to go through the other slides, but thank you so much.
Thank you very much, David. Now we should be hearing from Frantzeska.
Yes. Thank you very much, David, for this very interesting presentation, and also for your doctorate thesis, which I read with great interest. I noticed when I read your thesis and also in the way you were presenting today that you take, how do you say, a general perspective, the one of intellectual property rights as a group of rights. You do not diversify your conclusions so much. There are some parts in your thesis where you discuss separately, for instance, patent law, and I will come back to that. But in general, your conclusions and your analysis is based on intellectual property rights as a whole. And I'm wondering, when we're discussing the need for compensation and the nature of damages, would you say that all intellectual property rights have the same needs, thus should be compensated in the same way? You are promoting a flexible, how do you say, a calculation of damages. But does that also mean that the same flexibility is to apply to all intellectual property rights?
No, so I'm trying to be very clear with one thing, because that's was of course my main concern in the beginning. Or should I focus on only one intellectual property right, or should I do them all? And for me, I knew that just by trying not to look at one in particular, well, the alternative would be to look at all of them to some extent separately also, because that would be the only way to say that this is how you could approach this. Because, as I said, it's contextual, right? So you should not only look at the intellectual property, you should look at the specific right, of course. But for me, I think my conclusions are more general. And that was a choice I had to make. So of course it will be different. How is it? I can't answer that, actually, because I have obviously not dealt with a comparison in that strict sense between patents, trademarks, etc. Because my goal with my dissertation is to just lay the groundwork, so to speak, and try to unite intellectual property with tort law, damages law, Swedish principles, also in the European perspective. I'm thinking of it as taking the first step, or maybe 2 steps back, almost. And then I hope that me and some other people will keep on looking at specific areas, specific IP. Yeah.
Okay, and this brings me to my next question. You've pinpointed in your conclusions, and you've mentioned it today as well, that damages are not covered completely by means of the compensation granted. Do you think that this is IP specific, or do you think this is a problem in general when we're talking about tort law? I'm trying to say how intellectual property law dependent is this starting point somehow. I mean, the circles you showed us. Is there a bigger mismatch between damages and compensation in IP law, or is it pretty much the same?
I'd say it's pretty much the same, or at least I'd say that okay, of course, intellectual property, it's such an interesting starting point. So let's say, as for me, I'm not only this intellectual property guy. If you ask me as tort law or damages person, I simply see intellectual property as like a really good example, and that's it. Also because in intellectual property law, we tend to rely on the notion that this is property, right? So we use this metaphor that kind of invites us to think about property being damaged, etc., etc. Then we see that, oh, this isn't the case. But I would say that, well, you have similar problems in many other areas. And as soon as we speak about non-physical damages, that is. So as soon as the damage isn't triggered by physical damage, well, it would be the same conceptual problems in many areas.
And in your doctorate thesis, you're talking about, I'm not sure if I am using the correct term in English, where you're promoting a permissive or inclusive perspective in the calculation of damages, right? And I was wondering, how far is it from the way courts are calculating damages today? How far is your approach from what really happens in real life now?
Yeah, the question is, yeah, because I think it might not be that far away, or it might be really far away. The thing is that we don't really know, because the courts don't really state what they are doing. And I think that I have one, you could call it one main enemy in my thesis, like one main villain in my story. If it would be one, it's the concept of general evidence relief, like which we tend to apply a lot in Sweden. Like the court goes into the issue, and they just say it's so hard to prove the damage. We just go for general evidence release. Let's give them this sum. So, but if you ask me, well, some courts might just do that, and some courts might just, but without saying it, considering the actual factors. But I think that when designing lump sums or doing calculations, it's always this hybrid. So I'm pro actually trying to use the factors and the actual circumstances in the particular case. And I think that courts tend to think it's scary, because if you try to fall back on general tort law principles, everything will dissolve eventually. It's so hard to prove the actual damage. But I think that I'm trying to say that it's okay, because when you look at compensation, look at these factors and include them in the judgment, in the assessment, even though it's not only strict calculations on damage. I think that that's what I'm trying to do. Maybe they're doing it already. Then my message is, keep on doing it, but do it like you can do it, and you can pinpoint what you're doing also, and state it explicitly. But other courts might not do it, then my message is, well, start doing it. Can
I pose one final question, Eleonora, or is my time up?
Of course, so please go ahead.
Yeah, so David, thank you for your last comment. I was also thinking that your dissertation is very practical, and you say that now you're either hoping the courts are using this way of determining damages, or you hope they will anyway in the future. And I remember when I defended my thesis, I really had a message that I wanted to promote and reach the recipients. I think that's one of the ambitions of a lot of doctorate students. How do you think that your message will reach the courts? How do you change the way courts work? What is the way in the practical application of your conclusions?
Yeah, I think so. It's very practical also, but I'm not sure. It depends on whom you're asking. I think my goal was to So if you're an intellectual property lawyer, you would see this as practical, but if you're a tort law lawyer, you would see this as very theoretical, depending on which approach you have and if you're an academic or not. But I think, but it's funny, I think it's, if I have one message to the Swedish courts at least, it would be that the legal text is the main source of law. Use the legal text. Don't try to apply general principles that don't really apply in this area. So use the legal text. It is a source of law. So if I could do that, I'm happy.
Thank you very much. Eleonora, back to you.
Thank you very much, Frantzeska, and thanks, David, for sharing the insights of your research work. We now move on to consider a slightly different topic, and that is the area of copyright exceptions. It is a great pleasure to host Dr. Rendas. As you may know, he's been also active representing the Portuguese government before the Court of Justice of the European Union. So he also has very practical hands-on experience on how copyright exceptions should be interpreted. So we look forward to hearing from you, followed by a commentary offered by Professor Jan Rosén. Tito, over to you.
Thank you very much, Eleonora. Let me just share my slides. So thank you again, Eleonora and the IFIM board for the very kind invitation to speak on a topic which is simultaneously the topic that I love and hate the most. As doctoral graduates and doctoral students will know, the relationship we have with our PhD topic is a very ambiguous relationship, and mine is not an exception. So it's about exceptions that we will be talking about over the next few minutes. And as you know, copyright law impacts the quotidian life of all of us. We routinely engage in acts that, even if below our awareness, are regulated by copyright law. Acts such as quoting another author's work in an academic assignment. So for instance, quoting Eleonora's work in your own work. I suppose most of us have done that. Sharing a hyperlink on our Facebook feed, streaming a video on YouTube, or using a third-party image on a PowerPoint slideshow. These are all acts that are regulated by copyright law, even if we are not aware of that. So the lawfulness of these and other similar acts is determined by a legal framework that is composed of a set of exclusive rights and their exceptions. And I will be primarily concerned, as I said, with the side of exceptions. As you also certainly know, copyright exceptions, what they do is they treat as non-infringing certain categories of unauthorized uses that fall within the scope of exclusive rights. And as such, copyright exceptions foster a compromise between the private interests of right holders and the broader public interest in the dissemination of literary and artistic works. And in a system that is nowadays characterized by long-lasting and wide-ranging exclusive rights, exceptions provide a vital counterweight. To cite Professor James Boyle in a quotation that I like a lot, exceptions are the holes that matter as much as the cheese. So the core of the EU law on copyright exceptions lies in Article 5 of the so-called InfoSoc Directive and in the rules that guide their implementation, interpretation, and application, which have often been clarified or even established by the Court of Justice of the European Union. And the appropriateness of this framework has been the object of much controversy in scholarly and policymaking circles. Participants in this debate are largely split into two sides. We have one side, which nowadays gathers academics, information technology companies, digital rights NGOs, which vigorously opposes the InfoSoc framework on grounds that this framework lacks sufficient flexibility and that it fails to deliver on the legal certainty promise. And we have the other side, which is by and large composed of collective management organizations, creative industries, publishers, as well as some academics, which generally supports the status quo, arguing not only that it provides ample legal certainty, but also that it has so far proven to be adaptable to changes in the technological and the cultural landscape. So the two sides disagree on whether the InfoSoc framework should be reformed, But one fundamental idea seems to gather consensus, which is the idea that EU copyright law in general, and the framework of exceptions in particular, must achieve a balance between flexibility and legal certainty. And calls for compromise between these two values are quite common in copyright literature, and scholars and policymakers basically agree that the holy grail lies in having a legal framework that combines the best of the two worlds, that combines flexibility and legal certainty. So if you survey the way in which these concepts are employed in legislative acts and preparatory documents and scholarly writings, you will see that each of the concepts encapsulates two distinct policy objectives that the InfoSoc framework must strive to achieve. In what concerns flexibility, the framework should be basically adaptable to changes in the technological landscape, so to technology-related changes. And on the other hand, it should be adaptable to national cultures, to national traditions, to national specificities. Likewise, if you look at the concept of legal certainty, you will understand that it's used to refer to two related goals. First, the need to ensure that copyright law is capable of guiding the behavior of users and right holders on the boundary between infringing and non-infringing uses, so the guidance on the legal status of unauthorized uses. And second, the importance of promoting the harmonization of national laws. So what I did in my thesis was I conducted a critical evaluation of the structural features of the InfoSoc framework in light of these goals. And I concluded that most of these goals were met to an insufficient extent. So we will go over each of these four goals. In what concerns the goal of ensuring adaptability to technology-related changes, the InfoSoc framework, I think, is fundamentally flawed. Member states nowadays enjoy very limited freedom to legislate autonomously, and the burden of updating the catalog of exceptions rests largely on the shoulders of the EU legislator. The problem is that relying on periodic updates of the catalog of exceptions at the EU level is a very impractical solution, because the EU ordinary legislative procedure is very complex, it's very lengthy, and the level of lobbying that nowadays characterizes copyright lawmaking, as you know, makes the adoption of new legislation or the revision of existing instruments even harder. So I think that this casts considerable doubt over the idea that updating the framework of exceptions should be the task of the EU legislative power only. And to make things worse, exceptions like the ones that we can find in Article 5 of the InfoSoc Directive grant a limited degree of discretion on judges, which further contributes to the law's incapacity to adapt to technological change. It is true that, according to CJU case law, a teleological interpretation of exceptions may not be prohibited, but it bears the limits that flow from the linguistically possible meaning of their wording. Otherwise, it would not be an interpretation. And of course, the InfoSoc three-step test provides no relief either, because it works as a one-sided and right-holder-centric standard. Now, relatedly, I think that the framework would also benefit from an enhanced performance in terms of guidance on the legal status of unauthorized uses. It's true that the listed exceptions provide stakeholders with relatively precise indications. They are rule-like exceptions. They are not standards like fair use. But the need to apply the three-step test as a second tier of scrutiny ends up blurring the line between lawful and unlawful behavior, between infringing and non-infringing uses. So this ultimately corrodes the certainty that may emerge from the wording of the exceptions themselves. In addition, the courts that think that the solution that is dictated by the governing copyright provisions is unsatisfactory, it's unreasonable, what they have done in some cases is they have stripped off the straitjacket and they have bypassed those provisions. So in order to deliver reasonable and context-sensitive decisions, some courts, including the CJU and national courts, have construed the applicable copyright rules in a creative fashion, or they have applied doctrinal emergency valves like implied consent and abuse of rights, as the German courts have done in the Vorschaubilder saga, or the Spanish courts in the Megachini case. And I think that having judicial decisions sidestepping the rules that parties to the case and that stakeholders in general think will guide the court has a more adverse effect on legal certainty than having decisions guided by transparently open-ended provisions. If the most immediately applicable provisions conferred greater discretion on judges, there would certainly be no need to resort to these interpretative gymnastics, as some scholars have called them. Now let's move on to the third objective, the objective of ensuring adaptability to national cultures. I think that in this regard, the InfoSoc framework performs generally well. Although Article 5 leans clearly towards the continental European tradition of exceptions to the detriment of the common law system, which is the system of some EU member states, it does take national legal particularities into due consideration through three of its features. First, exceptions are optional, and the optional nature of exceptions means that member states are not forced to implement exceptions that they may find unnecessary. Some member states think that some exceptions are necessary, others don't, and the optional nature of the exceptions grants them freedom in that regard. Second, some of the national legal particularities have been incorporated in the catalog itself. The catalog is very long, it's very diverse, and it covers not only classic copyright exceptions like quotation and private copying, but also less common exceptions like those for religious celebrations and for building reconstruction. And finally, the grandfather clause is another element that contributes to the adaptability to national cultures, in that it grants member states some latitude to accommodate local and long-established exceptions. It should not be forgotten, however, that this respect for national legal differences and for the cultural diversity within the Union must be balanced with the need to achieve a harmonized framework of exceptions, with the need to ensure harmonization of national laws. And in fact, I think that in safeguarding national cultural autonomy, the EU has partly overlooked the objective of harmonization. The fact that the vast majority of exceptions in Article 5 is optional has contributed towards the preservation of a very unharmonized framework of exceptions, of a true mosaic of exceptions throughout the Union. And quite evidently, this feature can harm the functioning of the internal market, especially in the case of exceptions that are crucial for agents that operate across borders. And I think that the sudden move to online education that was caused by the COVID-19 lockdown is illustrative of this problem. The InfoSoc teaching exception is crucial to allow the use of third-party content in educational activities, especially in periods of crisis, such as the one that we are currently undergoing. The problem is that the optional teaching exception in the InfoSoc framework has been implemented in diverging manners throughout member states. To give you an example, in Germany, Article 60A of the German Copyright Act allows the reproduction and making available of 15% of a published work for the purpose of illustration for teaching in educational establishments in general. Now, in contrast, if you look at the Spanish teaching exception in Article 32, paragraph 3 of the Spanish IP Code, it allows the use of small fragments of works, but only by teachers in establishments that are integrated in the Spanish educational system or in public universities or research centers. So I think that this kind of divergence palpably reduces legal certainty for providers of courses and seminars with a cross-border character. So in light of this grim state of affairs, what I've tried to do is I've tried to pave the way for a future reform of the InfoSoc framework of exceptions. So I argued that in order to achieve a compromise between the different policy goals that I have just identified, the EU legislator should consider restructuring Article 5 of the InfoSoc directive as a multi-tiered framework of exceptions. So a multi-tiered framework composed of 3 tiers. The first tier would be a closed catalog of precise and mandatory exceptions for recurring uses with a relevant impact on the functioning of the internal market. This tier would include time-tested exceptions that apply to specific kinds of uses, such as quotation, private copying, temporary reproduction, etc., which will predictably keep occurring along relatively stable fact patterns, regardless of any supervening changes in the technological landscape. So these are uses that are socially common and that as such can be identified in advance in a relatively precise fashion. And the exhaustiveness of this catalog and the mandatory nature of the enumerated exceptions aim at securing a high level of harmonization and at mitigating one of the principal handicaps of the framework currently enforced that I was discussing a while ago. The second tier would be a catalog of optional exceptions that would reflect national traditions in this domain. These would be exceptions that lack the cross-border relevance of the ones provided in the previous tier. So we're talking about exceptions like the ones for religious celebrations, for the advertising of public exhibitions, for the proper performance of administrative proceedings, and so on. And for that reason, they need not be made mandatory, and their conditions of application do not need as high a degree of uniformity as the ones in the first tier. So this tier would be intended to uphold one of the main advantages of the existing framework, which is its capacity to respect the different domestic cultures and traditions in the realm of exceptions. I say that the second catalog is quasi-closed because the grandfather clause would be preserved to ensure that the list is not unduly long and not unduly detailed. So let's go to the more interesting part of the proposal, which is the third tier. The third tier would be a residual balancing test, empowering courts to decide on the lawfulness of certain uses on a case-by-case basis. And this tier would serve primarily as a safety net for unforeseen uses, and it would reflect the idea that as technology races forward, enumerated exceptions, I mean, may be left in the dust. They may be left behind. So the adoption of this balancing test would minimize the need for incremental and very costly legislative updates to the catalog at the EU level, while also eliminating the need for the improvised judicial constructions that we were talking about a while ago. So this would be a CJEU-made test in the sense that it would incorporate criteria that have some pedigree in the case law of the CJEU. So instead of performing a decontextualized transplant of US fair use, or instead of using the hopelessly incoherent three-step test, the proposal would rely on the wealthy body of CJEU judgments in order to increase the guidance of this test. So the test would require courts to examine whether a certain specific use achieves a fair balance between the interests of right holders and the interests of users on the basis of a non-exhaustive set of weighing factors, including the profit-making nature of the use, the effect of the use upon the volume of sales or of other lawful transactions relating to the work, and the capacity of the use to promote the practical realization of users' fundamental rights. Being a non-exhaustive list of factors, other concretely relevant considerations could also be taken into account. So towards the end of the thesis, I have tested the proposed model and this third tier in particular against real life cases involving, for instance, the online reposting of a photograph in the context of a school assignment. This is the Rankoff case, and the making available by the press of a politician's essay on issues of public morality. This is the Spiegel Online case. And alongside these cases that I've used in the thesis, I think that other uses related to the emergency situation that we are undergoing could be cited. And this would include, for example, the supply to researchers of copies of books that are now in libraries that may be shut to the public, and also the scanning by teachers of entire textbooks for remote seminars. There are public interest organizations like LIBER, which have called on the Commission to issue guidance on this kind of uses, proposing the adoption of extraordinarily broad constructions of the relevant InfoSoc exceptions during government-imposed lockdowns. And I think that under the proposed model, these too broad and inventive interpretations would not be necessary because the balancing test would be openly capable of accommodating these uses, giving copyright law the capacity to adjust to these periods of crisis. So to conclude, the new DSM directive provided the ideal occasion to go about a structural review of the EU law on copyright exceptions as the one I have just outlined. But the problem is that by merely updating the acquis with a modest set of exceptions, the new directive, I think, was largely a missed opportunity. Of course, some commendable choices have been made, like that of expanding the list of mandatory exceptions, but the broader course of action chosen by the legislator was unwise, I think. Anyway, given the present levels of polarization in the copyright debate, some might see any proposal to redesign Article 5 as politically infeasible. And I admit that the hopes for adoption of this sort of reform in the near future may be dim. But what I think is that the job of legal researchers is not limited to putting forward proposals that may be adopted in the short run. Instead, and all the more so in a very contested field of policymaking like copyright law, I think that academics have the task of pursuing independent critical inquiry and delivering proposals for the benefit of society as a whole. And that is, I think, what I try to do in my thesis. So apologies for the self-promotion, but the book will be coming out soon in February, I think. So if you're interested, you can buy it through Wolters Kluwer. Thank you very much for your attention, and apologies for maybe taking a few more minutes than I was allowed to.
Not at all. Thank you very much, Tito, for the thought-provoking research and presentation. We shall now be hearing from Professor Jan Rosén. So, Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Chairperson, for allowing me to speak. And my sincere thanks to Tito, who really has come up with a text which is most interesting and will be, I think, a major element for us all to study for the years to come. I read it as a manuscript, as you see. This book is the upcoming book. It's a very finely reasoned book, I would say. So my congratulations to you on that. It's written by an intelligent person who presents something intelligently to us. And by that, well, it's something to read and discuss. In particular, as this topic is, it's certainly not a mundane one, as some out there may think of limitations to copyright. Well, isn't not a mundane topic? It is not. It goes to the very core of copyright, one can say, to the very core of authors' rights. And it touches upon, I would say, legal philosophy and the major elements of what to do with copyright. What about authors' rights? What should they be about? And consequently, there are quite many legal scholars being active in this field, not least during the last few years, or not only legal scholars, but other actors as well. But in all this, I think you are handling this very, very wisely, and also you come up with a proposal actually to the EU legislature to do something which I find very plausible. It's not merely criticizing, it's not merely about that something is wrong or that we can't have it as we have it, but then what to do and what could possibly be done. I think you have a possible, well, in short, solution to all this. That said, I would like to dwell a little bit on a few elements of your book and your presentation. You are sticking your head into something which is quite complex. You know, there are limitations in a number, from an EU point of view, in a number of directives, right? And I think 7 or 8 directives have their own sorts of limitations. And then again, there's the InfoSoc directive and Article 5, of course, and with that sort of closed list. I think most of those who come into this topic think that this is all about Article 5 in the InfoSoc directive. It's not that easy, of course, which you are very well aware of. But what would you say as a starting point? Now that we have this complex material which sort of pops up in a number of harmonized directives, and in a more specific way in the Article 5 of the InfoSoc directive, that's a great job or a quite massive job to change this the direction of this ship, as you prefer. To start with, what would you say? Are you hopeful in the sense that yes, this is doable? If you ask me, I would say yes, and I like the results of what you come up with, but my opinion is not that important. So I would say you have written the book. What do you say about the possibilities in change the direction of this mighty ship that sails virtually also all around the world, right? With the same complexity.
Thank you. Should I answer now?
Yeah, could you? And I have other questions as well, but maybe just to put it on the arena, so to say, in this.
Of course. So I think that I recognize that the proposal is a utopian one. I have mentioned that in the thesis itself. It's not that utopian in the sense that it is a cautious proposal that does not do a major overhaul of the InfoSoc framework, but that changes it in surgical ways that tries to make it future-proof. Now, I am optimistic that we may be successful in the long run in changing the InfoSoc framework of exceptions based on the success that some academics have had in recent legislative reforms in the copyright domain. As we know, the EU legislator is more and more sensitive to the opinions of academics. They have been calling on academics to present their research in the EU institutions. So this gives me some optimism. I think they are more than ever sensitive to the importance of taking independent academic advice into consideration. And also at the national level, if you look at the German proposal for the implementation of Article 17, you will see a lot of academic influence in that proposal. So I think that both at the EU level and at the national level, there are reasons to be optimistic. Now, even if the proposal is considered utopian, and as I said, I recognize that it may be considered utopian, there's a saying that I like a lot, which says that today's utopia often becomes tomorrow's reality. So I like to hold on to that.
Thank you. Some of the words you are using quite a lot is flexibility versus legal certainty. And of course, that's the arena for the balancing act of handling limitations. That's for sure. Then again, I would say, well, there is the three-step text. Now it's manifested in the InfoSoc directive, it's in the TRIPS, and it emanates, of course, from the Berne Convention. And there have been dissertations written about the three-step test, and well, it's a phenomenon that's very much debated and discussed. One would say, well, what's wrong with it? Doesn't it open up for some flexibility, if you want that? And also potential legal certainty, because it's a problem, of course, to be flexible and at the same time predictable, right? Or unpredictability emanates from a wide amount of flexibility. So then I would say, well, the three-step test is an essay in that sense in order to handle or to balance those various interests. I think you call it hopelessly incoherent. And why not? And it is author-centric, of course, and that's what it is, but not very surprising, emanating from an act like the Berne Convention, which in itself is very author-centric, right? So is it not an instrument that is of some, is it not potent at all, would you say? It's there, of course, in the contemporary legislation, for example, of the EU, but for the future?
So I think that it's an excellent question. Thank you. And I think that if I was given the choice between not changing the framework and adapting the three-step test, I would of course choose adapting the three-step test. And among all the proposals for introducing flexibility into the InfoSoc framework of exceptions, the ones related to the three-step test, the ones arguing that we should have an enabling provision, a flexible provision modeled on the three-step test, are by far the ones with the widest currency in the literature. We have a number of proposals that argue that we should change the role of the test, or that we should re-understand or reinterpret the test. There's a wide number of proposals in that regard. And I think that those proposals, or at least the three-step test in general, has one big advantage, which is that the test's language is well established in international law, it's well established in EU law, it's present in various copyright directives. So by using this language, the provision would perhaps, the reform would perhaps progress along legislative chambers more easily. It's well-known language, it's been around for a number of years. But I think that before changing the role of the three-step test, we should carefully look at how European courts have been applying this test. And I think that the case law, both the national case law and the European case law on the three-step test, is very, very disappointing. National courts have been following radically divergent approaches. We have courts applying the three-step test in a strict fashion. We have courts applying the three-step test in a very creative fashion, like the Spanish courts in the Megachini case, which basically turned the three-step test into a sort of fair use provision. So the scenario is very mixed. It's very complex. And I think that this scenario doesn't get any more promising when we look at the CJU case law. The three-step test reasoning of the CJU and the meaning of each step are severely underdeveloped in CJU case law. The CJU, when it is confronted with the three-step test, dedicates just a couple of paragraphs. And it's not very different when you look at the AG opinions, at the Advocate General opinions. They also dedicate only a few paragraphs to the three-step test. So I think that this underdeveloped and confusing application of the three-step test by the courts may very well be related to the origins of the test. The test came up as a sort of diplomatic compromise in Berne conferences in order to enable contracting states to have as many exceptions as they wanted to the reproduction right. So it was sort of a diplomatic compromise. So I think that this explains why, in part at least, why the three-step test is not the best solution, but it may be a next to best or a second best solution.
Thank you so much. The construction of yours that you have presented to us in this three-tier construction, if I may call it that, that is, you keep a closed catalog, precisely formulated exceptions, and it would be mandatory. And the second tier would be then optional exceptions, like in Article 5 in the InfoSoc directive. And then the novelty, what would be a single mandatory exception, a standard type for uses by case. Now I want to ask you about the last one, because then it comes this single mandatory instrument that then obviously could be used by the courts, right? For them to fill in or to use when there are situations which are not foreseen or which are not being foreseen by the legislator, or that could match possibly the changes of technology or whatever, or the stream of novelties that come upon us when we use copyrights all the time. I can see that it's you're stretching out a hand or an offer really to the courts, and you believe in the court. It will be the CJEU probably that will handle this. But aren't we then there again that we are into legal uncertainty? You will leave with the CJEU to do whatever it finds appropriate over time when new situations come up, and could then transform the essence of copyright really by, let's call it a flexible application of this standard clause. Isn't there a problemacy in all that? I mean, the criticism of that has always been, well, then we don't have predictability, because such a clause simply will open up for all types of uses at any point in time that the court finds feasible, doable, for the sake of having or to talk for the user really, or the consumer, if you prefer. Well, is there something in that?
Of course there is, Professor Jan Rosén, and as you may imagine, I have struggled with that issue for a very long time in my thesis, and I think that there are several ways to answer that criticism. And the first one is the following. If we look at what the CJEU and at what some national courts have been doing lately, I think we can agree on this. We have a very restrictive system of exceptions. It's not an open system. It does not have an escape valve, an emergency clause, like fair use or something of the sort. So under this restrictive system, national courts and even the CJEU, when they look at a certain use and they think that the use is benign and they think that the use is good and positive for society, it has good social effects, what they do is they twist and turn the law in order to accommodate that use. They don't do, even if the answer, according to the existing system, even if the answer can reasonably be said to be clear and that the use is infringing, if they think that the use is beneficial for society, they will, as I said, twist and turn the law in order to accommodate that use. I think that this sort of approach is more prejudicial for legal certainty than having an honestly open clause, a transparently open-ended provision that says, okay, if the use is unexpected, if the use is not foreseen, you are allowed to do balancing. So I think this promotes more certainty. It may sound paradoxical, but I think that this promotes more certainty than what, for instance, the German Federal Supreme Court has done in the thumbnails cases. They have looked at thumbnails, the thumbnails shown by Google on the Google image search service, and they said, you know, this is good for people. Users want to find thumbnails of images online. Now, if we say that this is not exempted by the existing copyright system, the use will be found infringing, and we will have at least temporarily to shut down the Google image search service. So what they did was they resorted to the abuse of rights doctrine and to the implied consent doctrine in order to somehow find an escape valve that would exempt this use. I think this promotes legal uncertainty. I think that having a balancing test would be better in that sense. Also, it would be a subsidiary or residual balancing test. In order to minimize legal uncertainty, that's also why I preserve a catalog, or I suggest preserving a catalog of exceptions, and only resort to the balancing provision as a last resort. And then finally, I think that as it has happened in the United States, with time, of course, this would take a very long time, but with time, clusters of cases, groups of cases would form around the clause that would make it more predictable. So I think that case law would play a very important role in increasing legal certainty. Mm-hmm. But I have struggled with that question.
Mm-hmm. And rightly so. However, if time allows me, I would would also like to ask your opinions about, well, there's a new book, another book out quite recently written by Tanya Applin and Lylan Bentley, which is called Global Mandatory Fair Use. So they put, it's all in one basket, so to say, namely the Article 10 of the Berne Convention opens up for which is about quotation, but they use that instrument, quotation, as a vehicle for, well, in short, opening up copyright to users under some sort of a fair use. And their conclusion is that the Berne Convention would not deny that. It would be possible. They interpret it that way. I'm not sure everyone on the earth would agree on that, but it's a way to reason. I can't help then asking you. I don't mean that you should that you should present an analysis of that book. It's your book that is so important now. But that approach, which is a quite, I wouldn't call it rigid, but it's a drastical one, right? In a way that it sweeps or pretends to sweep around the whole globe an instrument in a way to handle exceptions, really, because very much is, of course, of being able to use excerpts of bits and pieces of full works. That is part of the world of quotations, right? So if that would be fair use globally, yeah, probably we could skip virtually most of those, or your scenery in the sense, with the closed catalog, the optional exceptions, and the single mandatory, etc. So what do you say about such a solution, if I may call it that they're offering? Do you find that plausible as parallel or adjacent to your presentation?
Of course, as you may have understood from the presentation and from the thesis, I'm a liberal-minded copyright researcher. So of course I like that solution. I think it sounds pleasing to the ears of any liberal-minded copyright enthusiast. But what I think that its main flaw is that it's overly optimistic. I think that we can use the quotation exception is certainly broader and more vague, and in that sense more similar to a balancing test than most exceptions. The quotation exception, because of the fair practice requirement and other requirements, allows you to conduct the sort of balancing that I propose in my third tier. The problem is that it bears the limits. The exception bears the limits that flow from the ordinary meaning of the term quotation. A quotation is a quotation, and the CJU has said in its recent case law that a quotation must have a direct and close link with the work that it is quoting. So there must be a sort of intellectual dialogue. I think that when we talk about quotations in our daily lives, this is the type of use that we are talking about. We are talking about using a work in order to intellectually engage with that work. That's quoting a work. So I think that using this provision to try and accommodate technological uses that we have no idea if they will resemble a quotation at all. I think that using thumbnails by a search engine does not look to me like a quotation. I don't see a quotation there. I see no intellectual dialogue there. Of course, we can extend the meaning of quotation to its limits and say that, no, there's no intellectual dialogue requirement. I think that's probably pushing it too far. So my view is that it's a good proposal, but it's overly optimistic.
Thank you so much. I think I'm done now. My congratulations to your brilliant presentation of a brilliant book.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both Tito and Jan for the very engaging discussion. And now let's move on to our final presenter of the day, Dr. Giulia Priora, who's now at Sant'Anna in Pisa and has written her thesis in Hungary on the topic of distributive justice in EU copyright. So thanks for joining us, Giulia, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for bearing with me in this very interesting seminar. Thanks for the organizer for having me. I'm approaching my first year anniversary of the doctoral defense, but being here with you, discussing the core essence of my doctoral thesis really makes it feel like as it was yesterday. So it's really a wonderful feeling. Let me share also, I have some slides. I hope you can see them in a bit. And here they should be. I'm also assuming that, okay, I'm also assuming, and we were actually informed that in the audience there are master and doctoral students. So I wanted to spend also a word just addressing a word of encouragement to them and telling them that the fact that it means so much for me to be here and present my doctoral research, it means that also, as Tito was highlighting, my doctoral path has been ups and down, a few moments of desperation, but the fact that it comes out as a thesis, as a dissertation, and occasions like this then occur to discuss it, it's really something valuable and something beautiful. My doctoral research deals with what I call an unusual duet. So the fact that it's not very common to see the notion of distributive justice as being associated to EU copyright law is something that definitely triggered my interest, my curiosity, and started almost as an intuition, first of all. I think also the previous presentation we heard today actually did a beautiful job in setting the ground and putting the right amount of emphasis on the notions of needed balance and on the notion of fairness as probably one of the fil rouge of today's IP and specifically copyright discussion. So I also thank David and Tito for having done so. Well, I'm doing something that I usually don't do. I skip the roadmap. I'm just trying to give you some suspense and stick within the time constraint that I have. And I directly jump into the core of my presentation, explain to you why copyright law and distributive justice is something that, as a combination, is something that may be actually mutually not only compatible, but potentially useful to explore. Now, by investigating both the compatibility and the potential utility of a distributive justice perspective, looking at, within the copyright framework, we definitely have to locate, or at least I looked personally at my own research within the realm of copyright theory. Now, we may be, let's say, tempted to sketch the copyright theory debate as consolidating throughout history and also definitely being characterized still today by the two really dominant theoretical, let's say, drives and strings, which are the natural law justification for copyright and the utilitarian justification of copyright. Nevertheless, we have, if we look closely and we have a PhD time to do so, we can actually explore further and see that numerous studies that are also quite recent are directly dealing with the question, what is copyright for? What are the purposes of copyright? And they do so more or less timidly labeling themselves as copyright theory studies. I looked and I had really a pleasure in studying multiple approaches and perspectives on copyright law, which look particularly at Europe, but also go beyond the European Union boundaries. And what I could feel and detect is actually some patterns that the scholarship is showing to us. One of them being an increasing focus on the social dimension of copyright law. So definitely that's something that can be translated into different notions. If one looks at more property-oriented studies of copyright law, then the emphasis will be on social function of this type of legislation. If someone explores the economic environment, then the focus will be on social costs. But in any case, we have this dimension of the social effects of copyright law being really one of the most distinctive elements of copyright scholarship when it comes to putting on the table innovative ideas and new theoretical perspective to look at the legislation, as also the discussion so far has in some spots already highlighted. There is another pattern which is mostly linked to the growing sensitivity, I would say, towards an empirical study of copyright law. So that's something that it's out there. It's occurring not only within the academic scholarship and academic debate, but rather it's happening also at policy level. So the call for an evidence-based and a sound evidence-based policy is something that also within the copyright theory has been perceived, and copyright theorists, let's call this way the whole category, are very much aware of. And third, but definitely not least importantly, there is a prominent centrality of the notion of fairness, something that probably gives us the perspective of the future of copyright law and the present and future of the study of copyright law, if we want to see it from an historiographical point of view, will be very much dealing with questions like how do we overcome the imbalances of copyright law, how we tackle the growing digital divide, how can we use copyright to solve problems which have to do with winners and losers, for example, or with economic imbalances. So the notion of fairness pops out when we talk about damages, as David did today, when we talk about exception limitation, as Tito portrayed, comes basically in almost every aspect of the copyright legislation. And again, obviously, this is not something typical of the European scenario. My own doctoral research sets the ground within this evolving scholarship and innovative views on copyright law, and tries to really understand whether distributive justice could be not only a buzzword, but could be a good entry point to understand how copyright is evolving and how probably the future of copyright law can be shaped. Now, there is a little caveat here to do. Distributive justice is a notion that we know, we are familiar with mostly in relationship with political philosophy. Usually it's commonly associated with the John Rawls theory of justice, but this is definitely not a notion that can be exhausted within one or two theories. It's a broad concept. A lot of theories tackling the equal distribution of resources in society have flourished throughout the centuries. What I want to stress is the fact that the perspective I'm presenting to you today and I unfolded in my dissertation is basically a shift of focus from how much within the copyright justification, from how much creativity we need to give some exclusive rights to the author, or how much remuneration, profits, economic incentive we need to give to the creator in order to produce that content. So I'm here referring to the traditional copyright theories related to natural law and utilitarian justifications. Well, a shift using this perspective of distributive justice towards a more attentive look on how the copyright relevant resources, being primarily cultural and informational goods and copyright revenues, are actually or should be distributed across society. So it's really a theoretical shift that doesn't want to pick one specific distributive justice, that doesn't pick specifically the Rawlsian perspective on distributive justice, but rather is something that let's see whether something useful is already out there within the EU copyright legal framework, and let's see whether we have any ideas, or I had any ideas how to apply it further. Now, the combination of distributive justice and copyright law is not something completely new. There have been scholars exploring this duet, this nice framing of the future of copyright law. Mostly these contributions tackle a macro idea of distributive justice. So looking at the geographical distribution of benefits stemming from copyright legislation around the world, mostly looking with a strong focus on the global south. And it comes also predominantly from commons theory. So looking at property theory and looking where property may actually fail to achieve the set objectives of its own legislation, relevant legislation. There are, as I was saying, this is not something new, but it's actually something also in progress. There are recent contributions exploring the idea of distributive justice, most often within the theoretical debate, but also in some specific, very practical, I would say, scenarios, mostly in working together in co-authoring with economists, looking at the effects of copyright law under a framework of sustainable distribution of cultural goods, of informations, or even of revenues, as we will see in a bit, is really one of the focuses of EU copyright law within this idea. Now, sharing with you the fact that it's not me coming up for the first time with the idea of distributive justice and copyright law being something worth exploring, the question of compatibility and of potential utility of this perspective I'm suggesting becomes rather a question of, is it really timely relevant right now to look at this perspective and to make it useful for EU copyright law? And this leads us to the second part of my presentation, which I named the descriptive. So can we trace actually a distributive justice rationale within the legislation we have right now pertaining copyright in the European Union? And my answer is actually yes. So that's a little spoiler alert. As the scholarship is virtually unanimous in saying the evolution of the policymaking when it comes to copyright in the European Union has seen a shift around 2009, 2010, which I personally label as a digital shift. So the fact that there have been at least two important communications by the European Commission, and the fact that there has been a plethora of actually measures and policy interventions which looked, and here I'm quoting, this is an explicit reference to the European Commission wording, which looked to build a more European, modern and fair digital copyright environment. This is something quite remarkable, at least in my view. Well, a more European copyright, a more modern copyright, these are quite self-explanatory terms. So here the EU legislator is referring to a copyright legal framework which is more harmonized, more effectively harmonized, and definitely more fit for the digital environment. But what really means a fairer digital copyright environment, that's something that remained more ambiguous, more controversial. My doctoral dissertation has a central aim, which is the one of testing whether behind this idea of fairness, this idea of fairness that is so crucial for the future of copyright law as the EU legislator sees it, well, if underneath this word, there is also a dimension of distributive fairness. And here, apparently, copyright scholars, and probably not only copyright scholars, but we have a thing for three-tiered structures. So it was very funny to see that also Tito came up with that three-tiered test and suggestion. But here also my suggestion is actually, it has three parts. Let's say it's a threefold analysis. The distributive fairness that I could retrace doing almost a systematization of EU copyright legislation in its whole complex nature touches upon a fair distribution of copyright revenues among right holders, a fair distribution of copyright revenues between right holders and intermediaries. And finally, and also probably most intriguing, a fair distribution of copyright material, so of cultural goods and informational goods between right holders and users. Now, for time constraint, I decided not to share with you the full systematization and the full trace, the full picture of the traces of this distributive fairness that I found across the European copyright legislation. As Professor Rosén was saying, it's very complex to connect all the dots and to put everything together in a slide. So I decided to focus actually only on a significant and probably most timely part of my analysis, which is the most recent DSM directive. Now, I call the DSM directive within the picture that I'm just portraying to you a wake-up call. The fact that it's not by chance that the structure and the substance of the provisions enshrined in this interesting directive and very debated are actually hinting at the same structure I gave to the notion of distributive fairness. So we have in the directive provisions directly tackling the fair distribution of the revenues among right holders. We have the second title, Articles 16 to 21, which build this strong intervention into copyright contract law, setting up a principle of fair remuneration to authors and performers, something that is absolutely not new within the copyright discourse in Europe, something that actually has become one of the main focuses, the protection of the weaker parties, the authors and performers in copyright contracts. But the directive actually goes further. It also gives us some provisions which actually not explicitly, but quite directly aim at balancing the distribution of resources between right holder and intermediaries. Article 15 and Article 17 are glaring examples of this. The fact that the press publishers have been granted a new right, a new neighboring right, in order to have a say, but also, and most importantly, have a share in the profits of the content they put out there in the internet. And finally, and as I said, this is intriguing, but also very tricky, so I'm expecting also probably more discussions on this later on. Well, the DSM directive introduces important mandatory exceptions and limitations. And the fact that we may see it applying or maybe through the lens that I'm suggesting of distributive fairness is something worth considering. The EU legislator may have the intent of distributing or better distributing cultural and informational goods by consolidating the carve out of exceptions and limitation and giving some room for users to actually have direct access and free use of certain material. So this is a little bit the wake-up call that probably, while we were very, very focused on debating the single articles of the DSM directive, we may have missed a little bit as a big picture and systematic structure of the directive itself. But unveiling, or if I managed in these few minutes to persuade you, convincingly telling you that I retraced a distributive rationale, a partial distributive rationale within the justification of EU copyright law, still the question is up for how could EU copyright law reach a fairer distribution of resources in society, and should the future EU copyright law do so, aim to do so. And these are questions that obviously I put together in the third and last part of my presentation, which I called the normative, because these are obviously very difficult questions, but also very deeply normative and philosophical question about what do we want copyright to do within its own justification and purpose framework. Now, the picture coming up from my doctoral dissertation is actually a mixed picture of lights and shadows. So there are, I could clearly see that there are strong limits, strong limitations against, or at least making it very hard for a distributive justice to take over. And there are also some opportunities. So starting with the former, I would say that it is probably even more utopian than what Tito was suggesting, thinking that we may replace the justification of copyright law from one day to another. So that's something that, even though I could have evidence of what I was studying, I could see the evolving nature towards a fairness which was also distributive within the legislation and the case law that I analyzed. Well, this is still a very unspoken, implicit, and concealed rationale that struggles to come to the surface. The traditional copyright justifications, as I was pointing at, are obviously very strong. We cannot simply expect the natural law justification, the utilitarian thinking about copyright to be repealed and replaced, I mean, anytime soon. There is actually another limitation, which is the intrinsically limited nature of the distributive justice theory. Now, when I was, before giving a caveat about what I mean by distributive justice, I put emphasis on the fact that it is something that looks at how resources are distributed, how content and revenues are distributed, but doesn't really interrogate itself enough about how this content exists in first place, or how we can incentivize and promote its creation and dissemination. So that's something that is very peculiar of copyright discourse. That's something that we shouldn't definitely forget. And that's something probably limiting also the utility of the distributive justice rationale within our own legislation. And finally, even assuming that these two first problems I just shared with you that I see, even assuming that we will find a way to overcome these obstacles, well, there is a very practical issue about how to implement an equal distribution of which resources, I would say. So this goes a little bit into the direction of the economic analysis of what I studied and I'm suggesting, because it looks at how copyright is a very complex legal framework that looks at several sectors and several types of resources. So the fact that these resources are heterogeneous means that we may expect them not to be always interchangeable. So to give you some real life examples, we should not and hardly could expect a right holder to be always happy and satisfied with, let's say, the trading of his or her power to decide over the destination and use of their own works with simply in exchange for money. Or we can find it very hard to project ourselves as consumers, as end users, to be absolutely fine in having a digital copy of a book, which is time limited, and maybe I cannot highlight, being totally happy in having that copy replacing a hard copy of a book in my library. So these are very pragmatic considerations that in this perspective should not be forgotten. But I want to conclude on a constructive and optimist note. There are also opportunities, and I dedicated a big part of my doctoral dissertation actually in exploring them and try to test them also in some real life scenarios. Now, the three main opportunities that I see within this theoretical framework are follow actually the structure that I displayed to you, follow the fact that we have a focus on the fair distribution of revenues among right holders. And here I see a very fruitful opportunity for reflecting on the copyright regulation of co-authorship. The fact that we may have missed in the harmonization process the focus on how and when we have strong and weaker parties or winners and losers within co-authored content, within co-authorship scenarios. And actually the steps that have been moved already by the EU legislator with regards to authors and performers, not the least the new directive with the principle of fair remuneration, could be thought as something useful to apply by analogy also in a co-authorship type of regulation. And then we have the two other focuses, which are absolutely very intriguing and very timely for the digital scenario. The fact that we want to fairly distribute resources among between the right holders and intermediaries, and these probably can open up a better and more consistent definition of what is parasitism, parasitic behavior, and what is free riding. And here I have examples, for example, the Article 17, the fact that we don't know, or we were very much debating about exempting, for example, non-commercial websites and blogs from that kind of liability regime, and the fact that we were not able to really draw a line between what is good and what is bad in free riding. And finally, and this is really controversial, but it's something that in a probably long-term future we could think of, is the fact that if we really want to start talking about distributive fairness also in regard of the trade-off between exclusive right and access, so looking at right holders from one side and end users on the others, well, we should start thinking about applying this idea or this idealistic perspective in critical non-commercial uses. So I think it's not a chance that also the previous presentation was focusing on some exceptions and limitations being particularly relevant and particularly, let's say, crucial for the digital society as it is today, as it operates today. It could be done in a less empirical way and more in a philosophical way by simply saying the democratic society needs uses for education, for informatory purpose, for private copy, simply by way of promoting a distributive fairness of this sort of material. Now, the conclusions are as mixed as the third normative responses, the third part of the presentation dealing with the normative responses. Are we heading towards a EU fairer distribution of copyright relevant resources? Should we be heading in that direction? Obviously, this is something that we still have to explore. We still take the time to explore further, and I'm also revisiting my own dissertation to explore and be stronger in the real life case studies that I also included. But that's definitely something fruitful to explore in a way of innovation and modernization of EU copyright law. That's something that probably is controversial as the own idea of fair balance and of fairness are. Probably it's something worth exploring with an act of bravery. But I really look forward for the discussion and questions and the comment by Eleonora Rosati to probably bring also the discussion further and find new solutions and new responses within my own dissertation frame. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Giulia. Very interesting presentation and very interesting work that you have conducted. I would say that one of the main values of your research is this emphasis, also from my EU perspective, about an additional lens justifying harmonization at the EU level. For a long time, the emphasis has been indeed on the internal market building rationale, also the digital single market strategy from which then the DSM directive came to be, has often been regarded as an internal market tool, and that is justified also in light of the legislative basis. But indeed, you were excellent at explaining that if one looks at the DSM directive itself, is not just internal market driven, but indeed it is animated also by a fairness rationale. And this makes me think of the work of scholars that finished their studies before you. For instance, the monograph by Anna Ramallo on the competence of the EU in harmonizing copyright. She also show how indeed there are different rationales justifying harmonization. And internal market lens is something that over the past few years has remained dominant, but not the only lens that has been used. And besides fairness, and the DSM directive contains provisions that go in this direction. Another lens that has emerged over time is that of competitiveness of the EU system vis-a-vis the systems of third countries. I think about the Orphan Works Directive, which was meant to compete with the United States, but also the DSM directive contains this particular angle. And here, for instance, I think about the text and data mining exceptions. Also, those are meant to safeguard the competitiveness of the EU system as a whole. So I think that your work is very important from this perspective. You also referred in your presentation to the notion of fair balance. It is something that is enshrined in a pre-2019 legislation itself. It is part of the InfoSoc directive. And we have seen the CJU referring to this elusive fair balance notion on several occasions. So we have cases in which fair balance is referred to the legislative duties of national legislatures and then interpretation by national courts. So you cannot alter the fair balance set forth at the EU level. Then in the context of interpreting exceptions and limitations, and this has also served the Court of Justice to move away from the idea that exceptions should be strictly interpreted towards favoring also the effectiveness of their interpretation and application. So the fair balance has been pivotal. We've seen references to fair balance in the context of construing economic rights. And here a clear example that you also refer in your work is that of linking and the right of communication to the public. We see both at the level of the Advocate General more than the Court of Justice, and then some national decisions that indeed this idea of fair balance, the importance of the internet, is something that needs to be safeguarded. And then more recently, we have seen a certain emergence of fundamental rights within the EU copyright discourse, and the need indeed to fairly balance competing rights and interests, which in principle are all on the same level. There is no right which should come before others. So it's not that intellectual property should prevail over freedom of expression. It is a fair balance that needs to be set. So the question that I would like to ask you is, how influential do you think this CJU case law has been also on bringing to the attention of the EU legislature the need to indeed safeguard and implement this fair balance? So what impact, if any, do you think the Court of Justice has had when it comes to more recent legislative initiatives?
Thank you. This is a very meaningful questions, and obviously this is, you spotted one of the part that I was also very sad to leave out from the purpose of presentation in order to be clear in what was the correct essence of my work. The analysis of the, not only of the case law of the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, but of the evolution and of the references that the court has done so far to the notion of fair balance has been one of the pillar parts of my study, and one of the analysis that took me a really long time to go through, due also to the vast nature of this case law, copyright case law at EU level. I think, I mean, right now, probably your question rings two, maximum three bells in my head. One being, well, we can stick to the idea of distributive justice that I'm suggesting, and we can see how important, how influential it has been to have a strong or at least a consistent body of CJEU case law on the protection of authors and performers. So that's something that we saw being very effective. We saw also being sometimes broader than the same legislation, and we saw also in terms of suggesting and promoting further legislation in this regard. So that's already an example that gives us the idea of how much the interpretation of copyright legislation is important, and also paves the way towards a new legislation for the future. The second thing, and you spotted also in my doctoral work, is the fact that I don't take lightly the scattering around of some few refined ideas of fair balance, or some timid implicit references to fair balance, which may hint at a fairer distribution of resources. Hyperlinking for me is one of the best examples. The fact that we need room for copyright exceptions and limitations, but also we are not talking only about copyright exception and limitation, we're talking also about other legal tools, for example, the extended collective licensing schemes, where really we can have a de facto distribution and access to copyrighted material, which doesn't harm too much the copyright holder. So again, are we talking about protecting one or the other, or are we simply talking about distributing resources to the best of our possibilities? So I think I'm flattered that you refer and you spotted the example on hyperlinking, because that's really something that hinted at something more beyond the simple notion to fair balance, which has become a buzzword. And the very final thought I have with regards to CJEU case law is the fact that I would stress a little bit more than what the scholarship is currently doing on the teleological inconsistency that we have there. So yes, we have references to the fair balance, but in order to reach a fair balance, we should agree and we should be sure about what copyright law is set to achieve in terms of purposes, specific purposes. And I think it's really not by chance that Advocate General Spooner in, I think, Funken Medien or Spiegel Online, but I think in the opinion on Funken Media, felt the need to restate what copyright is for, providing a twofold scenario of natural law justification and utilitarian justification, and sticking to that picture in order just to set the ground for, from here, let's remind to every one of us what copyright is for, and then build a solution to the current problem we are facing. So the fact that we are not really sure what copyright is for, sometimes in some very thorny issues we are trying to deal with and the court is dealing with, is actually an inconsistency that tells us how hard it is to promote modernization within the legislation. So I think that probably a brave and a stronger influence of the court in these regards, and a clear-cut language used when it comes to some critical uses, non-commercial uses, uses which are very close to democratic values and cultural values in our society, then this could actually help the legislator meeting decisions for the future on how to strike that fair balance. At least we would be on the same ground in understanding what that means.
Thank you very much. I invite all the participants to use the chat function if they want to ask questions. We don't have much left, but we can run over a couple of minutes. Giulia, a point that you have not touched upon in your presentation, but that I saw referred to in your provisional table of contents for the book, is the issue of moral rights, which you refer to as somewhat a moral imperative, no? So what kind of argument do you think could be made for harmonizing them at the EU level? I remember that a while ago, the European Commission conducted an exercise discussing whether further areas should be harmonized, and for moral rights, the conclusion was there is not an internal market problem, hence there is no need for harmonization. Do you think that the approach should be changed and that there should be a EU moral rights regime?
That's again one of the thorny issues I had to cope with in my own research. I can see that the legacy of moral rights and of their justification that they are hiding is actually one of the strong points against what I'm suggesting as a new perspective to look at the future of copyright law. Moral rights are actually not only a limitation. That's the conclusion I reached. On quite the opposite. There could be actually no distributive justice idea to talk about and to chat about, as we are doing today within copyright law, without a strong, firm protection of something on the side of the authors. And probably also, as probably I mentioned in one slide, the theoretical developments in the scholarship, looking more at authorship rather than ownership, are something that are actually reminding us who we are protective and how much we struggle to rebalance the relationship between authors and publishers. So moral rights is something that helps us actually getting there and keeping the focus on one side of the scale, on the author as the real beneficiary of copyright protection when it comes to exclusive rights and when it comes to incentive to or reward, either or, depending on the justification you prefer, of the work they do. Definitely, moral rights can be on the opposite side something that hinders a pushing towards a more flexible idea of copyright. But that's actually, that's why I call it a moral rights imperative. That's something that I find it within the framework that I'm suggesting very hard to change. So that's something that not necessarily is bad. Not necessarily we need an harmonization in order to reach or in order to unblock this obstacle and go further. But definitely something that we need to contextualize within the need we have to keep the focus on the authors. So I consider, I mean, by labeling it or by mentioning in my table of contents the moral rights imperative and developing this idea, I wanted to highlight the twofold nature of moral rights, both as a beacon of copyright protection and its purpose to protect the authors, and as actually the new way of pushing forward the legislation that is more, probably also more apt for real life challenges.
Thank you very much. I think that we have reached the end of the time at our disposal. I invite the participants to please reach out directly to our speakers with their questions. And since this is an holiday seminar, and of course we all wish something better for next year, I guess it's not difficult to imagine why. I would invite all our speakers to share one wish that is IP related for 2021. What would you like to see happening in your favorite IP field? I can start. My own wish for the forthcoming future is a referral to the Court of Justice asking to clarify who or what an author, and perhaps more importantly, a joint author is. We find the references to authors in these directives, but as you all know, it is very difficult sometimes to decipher the boundaries of this cornerstone of copyright law. So my wish would be for a referral of this kind. What about you?
May I?
Go ahead, please.
I wish Portugal to do a timely and reasonable implementation of the DSM directive.
Excellent.
I would go practical on something that is very dear to me right now. And my wishful thinking is to see actually a nice and interesting copyright debate on how the use of protected material in educational settings, especially for the situation we are all living, is something that should not hinder the practices or should not scare teachers and students in the activities they are carrying out.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, and I suppose in my area, I guess I've always been wishing for the EU court come up with some distinct ruling, but that's too unrealistic. So I'm just hoping for the Swedish courts to start looking at the enforcement directive. What if they would actually look at Article 13 and compare it to Swedish law and say that this can be the opportunity, but that would never happen. But that's my wish. You know, the Swedish court referring to EU law articles. I don't think so. That's my wish.
Frantzeska, Jan, Jonas.
I have if not a wish, I have a hope for the next year to come, namely that the organizing of the CJEU in sort of in groupings or in departments focused on intellectual property, for example, that will strengthen the expertise of the court. Now that the CJEU is so very important for the copyright or intellectual property developments of the EU EES area, I think this can be something that makes it more consistent and producing more let's say, relevant and adequate decisions for us.
I would wish that the Commission actually looks into the supplementary protection certificate system and proposes real reform and not asking for new reports and new research reports. I think there is a time and possibility to actually review the system as a whole. That would be my wish.
Views from Jonas or from our students from the LLM, what you'd like to see happening besides an excellent grade in your master?
Well, just thinking right now, because it's something that I went to study, but I don't think that's going to be for the next year, but maybe for the future. What reasonable time means in the DSM directive in Article 22, what is a reasonable time? I can also wish for a copyright reform back in Brazil, but I think it will be easier to meet a unicorn at this moment.
Thank you.
Well, I don't know if I wish, well, I do wish that we will struggle to make the intellectual property field less complicated and diversified. On the other hand, this development seems to keep us busy. As they say in Germany, warum soll man es einfach machen, wenn man es alles so schön komplizieren kann? Perhaps a wish.
And Riana, we need to hear from you, and then we shall be closing.
I suppose I'd just love for the YouTube judgment to come out, preferably before I finish my own dissertation. That'd be lovely.
Perfect. Then we thank all our speakers for being part of IFIM event today. More IFIM events to come soon. Please check out our website for announcements and dates. Thanks to all the participants for joining us today, and let's hope that we are able to meet in person very soon, and that indeed, besides great IP news, 2021 brings us even good things, also good things in other fields, including from a health point of view. So thank you everyone, and enjoy the festive season.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.